I dig it. All right. Thank you all for coming. We'll go ahead and get started here. Both of our speakers today, as usual, have long and illustrious careers with too many things on their resumes for me to recount them all, so I'll be brief in the introductions. Our speaker, Ilya Shapiro, is a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute, and he's editor-in-chief of the Cato Supreme Court Review. He's also one of the leading court watchers in the nation, I would say, if that's a fair claim to make. He, interestingly enough to me, was special assistant / advisor to the multinational force in Iraq, so one of the few court watchers that's been deployed to the war zone. And he's also worked as a litigation associate at Patent Logs and Clear.live. His JD is from the University of Chicago, and he speaks English, Russian, Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, so pretty much all of the languages. Offering comments today is our own Professor Frank Goodman, who really needs no introduction here at Penn. He studied philosophy, politics, and economics as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He's been teaching at the law school for longer than most of us have been alive, I think. Quite a bit of experience. He clerked for Judge Hasty in the Third Circuit and practiced entertainment law in Beverly Hills. He teaches here, he teaches constitutional law and federal courts, and occasionally other courses, including constitutional theory. So with that, we'll welcome Mr. Shapiro up to.
Thank you. I was just trying to look up the dates of a couple of the key cases. Perry versus United States, I didn't get to, I think it was during the New Deal, late 30s, I believe, and Fleming versus Nestor, 1960. I'll get to those cases. So during this obviously came up most recently, and Lee, by the way, I think I'm going to stick to English for this presentation, if that's okay. During the debt ceiling debate, the government shutdown debate over the last few weeks, kind of separate issues really, it was kind of a replay of some constitutional issues that came up during the 2011 debate over the same issues that eventually led to the super committee and the proposal for cuts and reforms that never got approved, and that led to the sequester. And the question, it keeps coming up when the debt ceiling is about to be reached, when the Congress passes a law saying that the United States can only borrow a certain amount of money. And the issue was, if that's being reached without any further agreement, what about all of the other appropriations that Congress has legislated? What about the entitlements, Social Security payments? What about payment of the debt itself? Doesn't Section 4 of the 14th Amendment render the debt ceiling unconstitutional? Section 4 says, the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned. So this is a provision of the 14th Amendment, the post-Civil War amendments, that said, after Congress repudiated the Confederate debt, it wanted to make sure to promote the flourishing of the economy and prevent economic collapse, that United States debt, from the Union, would not be questioned, and indeed constitutionalized the idea that the debt of the government had to be paid. But it raises a number of questions. What is debt, first of all, most basically? Is it just bonds that are issued, securities, to finance the government? And if it's just bonds, is it just the principal of those bonds or the interest as well? Is it more broadly any obligation that the United States government might have, whether it be, well, pension is mentioned here, so entitlement programs, whether it be an appropriation by Congress. Congress said we're going to spend X on one program, X plus 2 on another program, Y on a third program. All of that now cannot be questioned. Is that the definition of debt? And what does cannot be questioned mean in the first place? Does it mean that no action can be taken by the government that might increase the possibility of default in the future? Probably not, because there's lots of things that government does depending on how you score the economics. Raising taxes, lowering taxes, incurring more debt, cutting spending, increasing spending. All of those sorts of actions at the margin have an effect on the ultimate probability, minuscule as it may be, of an ultimate default. Does it mean simple repudiation, saying that the government changing its mind, or Congress passing a law saying we are no longer obligated to pay this particular debt, or all of our debt? We're just going to kind of do it Argentina style and go along as we want. Or does it mean a default? A default itself is unconstitutional, meaning my boss, the chairman of Cato, wrote an article making the following analogy, that if I loan some money to my friend and the debt comes due, and he says, I can't pay you. I fully recognize that I owe you this money, I'm not repudiating this debt, but I'm broke, I can't pay you. So he's not repudiating, but he's in default, effectively. Is that the sort of questioning of the debt? And those are not easy questions or clear, they're not clear answers, I think, to those questions. There have been multiple solutions that have been proposed. For example, the President in Article 2 has to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So under the Take Care Clause, some have argued, most notably Eric Posner of Chicago, Nathan Vermeule of Harvard, that the President has a certain inherent power to pay debt, pay our obligations, prevent a constitutional crisis or an economic crisis. It's almost like when the country's invaded. There's inherent executive power to act to prevent economic collapse. The Constitution isn't a suicide pact. That sort of thing. This kind of robust view of executive authority. Others say that that's too broad, that we can get a little more textual or a little more kind of nuanced in our analysis. There's a famous, I think the only large article still that's been published, there's 3 of them now, by Neil Buchanan of George Washington University and Michael Dorff of Cornell, about the trilemma problem. That is, if the debt ceiling is reached, the President finds himself in a trilemma. It's unconstitutional, there's a congressional law that says he can't borrow more money. It's unconstitutional for him to do that unilaterally because the power of the purse is charged to Congress under the Constitution. He can't simply raise taxes unilaterally by himself to meet the debt obligations. Similarly, that's the power of Congress. He can't cut spending unilaterally. Even if that weren't clear textually, there's the Federal Impoundment Act that was passed under Nixon, was it?
Nixon?
Yeah.
1974.
Yeah, 1974. That says that the President, just to make clear, the President doesn't have the authority to prioritize certain type of spending or not spend the money that Congress has appropriated. So there's this trilemma. Each way that he might act to solve the fiscal crisis, or to make sure that to vindicate Section 4 of the of the 14th Amendment is unconstitutional. And they say the President then has to choose the least unconstitutional method, which they argue for very good reasons within their paradigm, is going through ignoring the debt ceiling. That the President has to take charge that that the laws are executed. Congress has appropriated this. The President unilaterally raising taxes is a non-starter. I mean, that seems very violative of basic principles of separation of powers. Spending as well, again, if it's not even clear from the Constitution, it's a federal law that Congress made clear. The President can't simply not spend what Congress appropriated. Therefore, going through the debt ceiling, which they argue, is the least unconstitutional measure. The response to that, and there's this debate, by the way, I should say, is kind of cuts across partisan lines. There's not the liberal position or the conservative position or the libertarian position necessarily. There might be on certain parts of it, but overall, for example, we saw Eric Posner, Adrian Vermeule about that executive power, strong executive power position. Sean Wilentz of Princeton University, he's not a law professor, he's a history professor, but he writes about constitutional history, and I was on a panel with him at the National Constitution Center yesterday. He was talking about the Civil War origins and the debates in Congress about this Article 14th Amendment, Section 4, and the rest of it. He doesn't go quite as broadly as Posner, but still very broad executive authority. And they're generally on different sides of the ideological aisle. And then you have Larry Tribe, Harvard law professor, very liberal, who says that this trilemma idea makes no sense, that you can't we have no real way, legal way of weighing the relative unconstitutionality of different provisions. And if you want to argue for that sort of position, then you have to admit that it's all unconstitutional. The president says, I have to act unconstitutionally because I have no constitutional ways to act, and history or Congress, if they want to impeach me, can judge me, and the American people can judge me, but this is what I have to do. But it's not all of a sudden the least unconstitutional method becomes constitutional. And agreeing with Larry Tribe is the conservative Michael McConnell of Stanford Law School, former 10th Circuit judge. Bob Levy, libertarian, Cato's chairman, says that a lot of libertarians or conservatives, Professor Goodman called this the conservative position. That's probably right. There's probably more conservatives saying this, that if the debt ceiling is reached, well, debt really means debt. Indeed, later in the 14th Amendment, in Section 4, there's the word obligation is used separately. Let's see, where is it? Neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection, so that the Confederate debt, or any claim for loss, but all such debts, obligations, and claims. So debts, obligations, and claims are different things. It's not necessarily entitlements. Anyway, so there is some background backstop for the argument that debt really means debt, or debt plus interest, because that's what the government has contractually obligated itself to pay with those. And therefore, there's really no crisis until the net inflows from taxation aren't enough to cover not all of the government's obligations, but just the debt and the interest. And then, but that's only kind of punting the issue, because it says, okay, well, we have enough money for a while and then we reach the same trilemma or what have you eventually. Anyway, but until that point, the conservative argument says, the president, it's not so much that he's prioritizing among different programs and issuing a line item veto. Aha, I've always wanted to get rid of that subsidy for the Mohair Museum in Nebraska or what have you. Now I can finally do it. But he prioritizes the debt, and then I guess, there's different theories on this, but kind of like a sequester, just takes whatever percent off the top of all appropriations. Could be the solution about how to go forward. There's a practical problem with that. Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, when this started becoming an issue again, said, even if that's correct as a matter of law, for practical purposes, we simply don't have the technology, or the government machinery is so big and convoluted, we simply can't just take 10% off of Social Security, or all of the payments to contractors, the way that everything's being processed. We simply don't have the mechanism to do it. It would, cost more money to try to put in this new type of constitutional sequester, or whatever you want to call it. So there are practical problems, even if there's a legal solution in that way. Bob Levy says that okay, we accept that debt is obligations as well. When Congress passes a law funding a program, they are making a commitment. The president has to fulfill that law, and we violate the separation of powers if we lower that. In that example where I've lent my friend the money, it doesn't matter to me whether he's repudiating or whether he's saying, oh, I can't pay you right now, but at some future point. I mean, I suppose it makes me feel better if he still says, oh, I still owe it to you, but if he never pays that back, that's still the same result. But he says the debt limit still is constitutional because Congress is only stopping that particular method of raising revenue for the president. There's also the possibility that the president could sell public lands or print more money or do certain other things. Leaving aside this issue of the platinum coin, perhaps you've heard of the $1 trillion platinum coin, because in the Constitution, for some quirk, there's the power to mint commemorative platinum coins. Could we just have a new coin to back the money supply? But ultimately, Levy says, and I agree with him on this, that the president has to act with Congress for it to be constitutional. There are other methods. We don't want to go beyond the debt ceiling. There are other things, but the president can't act alone. And I think that's right. And I think that whether you frame it as a trilemma, whether you frame it as we have an economic crisis, something needs to be done, the Constitution's not a suicide pact. I think ultimately, if the president is acting alone, he's acting extra-constitutional, and it's kind of like the Lincoln situation, where he suspended habeas corpus, which was not strictly constitutional. But he said, shall it be the case that all the laws are observed, are violated, but this one, because the whole government falls because of it. So I don't think it's inherent power. I mean, I recognize that it's unconstitutional. I would prefer that Congress simply, the president recognizes that it's better not to act unconstitutionally, so he has to agree with Congress to cut their appropriations, cut their spending, to get it within our borrowing limits, rather than act unconstitutionally. But if he feels that he can't do that, or he feels that no deal can be reached that allows him to execute all the laws that he has, that he's responsible for, to carry out his oath of office, because of course the presidential oath of office is also in the Constitution, then he should, as I mentioned earlier, simply say, it has come to this, I have no constitutional options, I believe that for the sake of the Republic I have to do this, and if Congress wants to impeach me because of this, go ahead and try. There's a will to do that, not a will to actually solve the crisis. You could play the political game in that manner, but ultimately these are political judgments. I mean, they have to be, regardless of whether one legal position or another is right. And as you can see, I'm hedging quite a bit, which is unusual for me. I'm normally quite an opinionated guy. But I don't think courts will ultimately be the ones that are deciding this. Even if you get past the question of who has standing to challenge this unilateral presidential action. Congress with a resolution, so Congress couldn't pass any laws, but they can all of a sudden pass a resolution challenging the president. That's not really going to happen. But even if there were standing, I think any court would treat this as a political, non-justiciable question. So I'm sorry not to leave you with a very satisfying answer, but I don't think there's a great deal of clarity here. It's virtually, well, it is unprecedented. We've never faced it. We keep coming up to the line, and then something happens. But that raises the issue of government by continuing resolution rather than actually having a budget. For 4 years, no budget even cleared the Senate. One time the president's proposed budget unanimously failed the Senate. Last year the Senate did, or this year the Senate did pass a budget, which was DOA, because the House passed a completely different budget. There's no way to reconcile them. But the federal government has been running on continuing resolutions, plus the sequester now, for Obama's entire administration. And that, I think, is ultimately the root of these economic loggerheads. And solving that, the overall budgetary issue, that will, I think, impasse, once and for all, sort of obviate the debt ceiling debate. Thank you.
I don't have much to say. I thought that was an absolutely brilliant presentation of the issues, and all of them. And I agree entirely with Ilya that there are no clear answer to it. I don't have a clear answer to it, and I have no strong disagreement with anything he said. So shall I just sit down? I'm even more opinionated than you are, but in this occasion I'm probably even more unwilling to venture an opinion. Well, I'm going to let Ilya's summary of the general problem and the solutions that various writers, lawyers and academics and other commentators have offered stand as my own introduction as well. I think you told me I only had to talk for 5 minutes. We'll see. I'm going to distinguish between what I call the liberal position and the conservative position. No, there are, this is not a perfectly accurate description of the two camps. By and large, though, the liberal position is that the debt ceiling is unconstitutional in violation of Section 4 of the 14th Amendment for a couple reasons that I will identify. And if not that, then it is unconstitutional because it puts the president in the trilemma situation that Ilya described, in which anything he does or doesn't do is unconstitutional. He can't simply resign the office and let Joe Biden handle the question. That would be a way of avoiding any unconstitutional action on his part.
He could threaten to talk until Congress does something.
You think that that would be an unrealistic threat for him? I agree with Ilya that the president must work with Congress, only I would put it the other way. But let's get to that. I think that the debt ceiling is not unconstitutional under Section 4. I think for the same reasons that Ilya does, that legislative history and precedent, Fleming versus Nestor in 1960, which basically says that Social Security payments are not obligations that Congress is required or the President is required to satisfy on pain of violating the Constitution. They do not even have the stature of contractual obligations. And not all contractual obligations rise to the level of being part of the public debt of the United States under Section 4. So I think Fleming versus Nestor is a very strong precedent. Precedent, history, the text of Section 4, as he already pointed out, supports the narrow view of, quote, public debt. And an alternative argument that liberals sometimes make is that even if the public debt of the United States includes only the principal and interest of formal debt obligations, not obligations created by mandatory spending statutes such as Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. Nevertheless, defaulting on Social Security and Medicare, which itself, liberals argue, would be unconstitutional, given the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, which requires that the money appropriated by Congress be actually spent by the President. If there were a default in spending for Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, by default I mean spending less than Congress has ordered to be spent, that would spook the market and raise questions as to the willingness and ability of the government to meet debt obligations narrowly defined. And that's what Section 4 prohibits, and questioning of the public debt of the United States. I think that argument also is very much attenuated, far-fetched. It requires you, first of all, to make the empirical assumptions that failure to pay Social Security is going to result in an interest rate spike with respect to government bonds. That seems to me unlikely, in fact, to happen. And then it requires the further claim that the questions that might arise in the minds of potential investors constitutes calling into question the public debt of the United States. I wouldn't accept that argument. In that, I agree with others tribe and McConnell, as well as, generally speaking, most conservative commentators. So I would agree that there is no violation of section, that the adoption of the debt ceiling does not itself violate section 4. The other argument, though, that it creates the inescapable trilemma whereby anything that the president does is unconstitutional, and he has no choice, therefore, but to violate one or another of these legal payment requirements. He must either shrink the payments for entitlement programs or other congressionally mandated payment requirements, spending requirements, or he must borrow money to fill the gap between tax revenues and the expenditure requirements, and do so in violation of the debt ceiling. Now, the argument that he's got to choose between one or the other of these unconstitutional actions seems to me a sound argument. The question is, which one should he ignore? The debt ceiling or the payment requirements under the entitlement programs and other programs? And I think the reasons that I don't see in the literature, it seems to be very obvious ones, and they're probably in the literature somewhere or other. They're not in the Buchanan-Dorff analysis, which is the...
This is what's funny. The literature is these 3 Dorff-Buchanan articles. 2 of them are pretty short. They're in the online version of the Columbia Law Review. And then a bunch of op-eds and interviews with people, basically. Kind of a very weird, moving target sort of live constitutional argument that doesn't even have, a series of pre-New Deal, post-New Deal sort of precedent that the Obamacare argument had. There's these 2 cases that President Goodman mentioned that I forgot to during my presentation. One of which, from 1935, is dictum and wasn't even the majority holding, Perry, and the other one is the Social Security case from 1960. But it's all kind of speculation and theorizing on the fly through op-eds. Sorry.
I don't like theorizing, and I don't think the precedents are particularly powerful on either side, neither Fleming nor Perry. But I guess what I'm getting to is that I think that the least binding, so to speak, of the several limitations on the president's constitutional action here is the debt ceiling. The argument is sometimes made, and prima facie it seems at least plausible, is that the debt ceiling has somehow or other superseded or relaxed the obligatoriness of the spending requirements in the entitlement programs and other military programs and veterans benefits programs and so forth that would otherwise have to be faithfully executed by the President under the Constitution, so that his failure to comply with the statutory requirement constitutes a constitutional violation in addition. And the argument is that putting a debt ceiling represents a judgment by Congress that these prior already existing spending requirements should be relaxed. Now, Congress certainly does have the power to relax those requirements. Those are not themselves constitutionally entrenched. Congress could repeal the Social Security Act without violating the Constitution. It could repeal the Medicare and everything else. But of course it hasn't done that, it isn't willing to do that, and it hasn't been willing even to reduce payments, even slightly, under those statutes. And the question then is whether or not the debt ceiling represents a judgment by Congress reducing the obligation of those other actions. And I would say no, that there is nothing implicit or explicit in the debt ceiling statute that in any way relieves the president of the obligation to comply with the spending requirements of those other statutes. I might feel differently if, in fact, the debt ceiling had been enacted by a majority of both houses of Congress and signed by the President. Then I might be willing to say implicit within that decision is a relaxation of the requirements of all of these other statutes that were likewise passed by usually very large majorities of both houses of Congress and signed by the President. But the debt ceiling wasn't that at all. In the past, the debt ceiling increases that produced the debt ceiling at any given moment in time were all enacted against a background where everybody in Congress agreed that this was not going to be the final word. And if further legislation or further applications of the payment formulae in existing legislation required higher debts to be incurred, more debts to be incurred, more bonds to be sold, that the debt ceiling would almost automatically, if not strike the almost, be increased commensurately so as to make it possible for those spending obligations to be met. That was the standard assumption behind every debt ceiling increase. There were 90 of them in the 20th century. 90 times the debt ceiling was increased, and not once was it really controversial. In the 20th century, it's been the 21st century, what did I just say, 19th century? It's the 20th century, it was done 90 times. In the 21st century, it's already been done 14 times, 7 times under George W. Bush, 7 times under Obama. It has only been really controversial once, and that was in 2011. And not really there either, because when push came to shove, Congress caved completely, just as it was prepared to do and knew it was prepared to do all along. This time, the decision in 2013 to raise the debt ceiling, ultimately on October the 16th, was passed overwhelmingly in both houses of Congress. 81 senators voted for it, only 18 voted against the increase in the debt ceiling a couple weeks ago, a few weeks ago. And in the House of Representatives, there were 144 negative votes. That about 2/3 of the House of Representatives ended up voting to raise the debt ceiling. If, in fact, on that occasion or on any future occasion, the debt ceiling is not increased because the House of Representatives refuses to do so, it won't be because a majority of the House doesn't want the debt ceiling raised, let alone they are implying that other payments ought to be cut back on. It will simply be because John Boehner has refused to put the thing up for a vote, that's all. Because he's following his own party's Hastert rule, which says that nothing goes on the floor unless a majority of Republicans favor it. That is the only process by which it is even remotely imaginable, it seems to me, that the debt ceiling would not be raised. And the only conclusion I'm drawing from that, I could give you figures about, let's see, in order, it takes only 27% of the members of Congress, 118 members of Congress out of the 435, which is 27%, to block, under the Hastert rule, to block any piece of legislation that the other 73% of the body favors, perhaps strongly favors. So that the Hastert rule, if applied, which it never is down when push comes to shove, but always is otherwise, under the Hastert rule, the counter-majoritarian feature of the House of Representatives is much stronger than the one in the Senate. It takes 41% to filibuster a bill that a majority wants in the Senate, but it only takes 27% to block legislation in the House. You said I'd be talking about the Hastert rule. I didn't see any connection just from that conversation. The only conclusion I'm drawing from that is that it would be wildly far-fetched to attribute to the debt ceiling a proposition that Congress wants to have Social Security payments terminated or delayed or reduced. Congress doesn't even want the debt ceiling in the first place. It wants to raise the debt ceiling. So I'm left with the trilemma being unresolvable simply by attributing some sort of supersession to the debt ceiling. And so the president will do, also the president says that we can't physically, we cannot technologically, with our present technology, prioritize even the payment of the debt narrowly defined, let alone prioritize all the other payments, which the conservatives generally argue ought to be. Senator Toomey's prioritization bill that he has, I don't know that he's actually presented it this time, in 2013. He presented it in 2011, it was rejected by the Senate, it certainly would have been vetoed by the President. It calls for prioritizing payment on the debt and Social Security payments and military payments. I think the salaries of people, military people on active duty. And then letting the President at his discretion prioritize everything else. Other conservatives simply say everything should be prioritized because we don't have a statute like Senator Toomey's and we couldn't possibly get one. So everything gets prioritized. I'm not sure whether that's constitutional or not. But in any case, the President says we don't have the technological capacity to do that because under our present technology, our computer payment programs are programmed to pay all obligations, including debt payments and entitlement payments and so forth, as they become due with whatever dollars revenue has come in on that day. That's the way we have to do it. Yes, Congress could order the President to change the computer payment systems in such a way as to make it possible to prioritize, but Congress has not done so and couldn't do so, couldn't get it through, get the President to sign it probably. And in any event, it would take a long time. And the argument that it would take a long time and cost a lot of money to shift over the computers has got an awful lot more credibility this week than it would have had 2 weeks ago. So I suppose then that the Supreme Court and the impeachment process are the only ways by which these issues are going to be resolved. The Supreme Court probably will never take the case because of the non-justiciable political question obstacle. That would be my guess. And as far as impeachment is concerned, I don't think that the Republican Party is willing to commit suicide the way they avoided 2 weeks ago and seem to not mind doing with Bill Clinton in 1998. The prospect of the least popular branch of government or segment of any branch of government in today's American government and probably in the modern history of the American government, impeaching a president who has just been reelected with a very comfortable margin for his second term seems to me, for many liberals, almost delicious. I would regret it wistfully. Ha ha. Okay.
Do you want a few minutes to respond, or do you just want to start with questions?
No, let's have some questions. Thank you for that comment. Back to the back.
I was wondering if you can talk about the competing narratives on the left of them saying that, Congress has never really held a gun to the president's head in this over the debt ceiling, versus on the right, them saying, this is always how it's done, it's always this negotiation, and the debt ceiling is always in play, and it's kind of the historical context of those competing views.
From what I understand, there's increasing tension between Congress and the President on everything at this point. It's kind of this ratcheting up, regardless of whether it was under Bush with the Democrats in control of Congress or now under Obama. And whether you're talking about judicial nominees or other nominees, or recess appointment, every kind of area where there can be clashes between the branches, they're occurring because the American people in their infinite wisdom, combined with residential patterns and a bit of gerrymandering, have elected to control their government to completely what's the word, insoluble positions of the role of government and the nature of governance and so forth. So until the voters block that jam, we're going to keep coming up with it. But I don't recall, and I think Professor Goodwin is correct, that in the 20th century the debt ceiling really, there's a little bit, every time it came up there would be like an article, are we spending too much money? And then Congress would, raise the debt ceiling and that discussion would go away. And it really has only come up in the late Bush and now Obama years where this has become a big political, almost rising to the level of constitutional crisis, and now it's almost to the point where it's Chicken Little trying the sky is falling because well, they're going to raise it eventually anyway, and it'll just come right up to the brink 1 minute before, and the markets even in this last debate. I think the official default date was October 17th, and it was there was a resolution October 16th. I don't think the markets even went down ahead of it. They were like, all right, this is, and now we're used to it. Fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on me. So the markets are just, all right, this is Washington shenanigans. We'll just price into our future models this political gridlock and instability, and can't get anything done. But they don't pay attention to it anymore. So. I think this is a historic anomaly, but the trend is again. It's if you have very and the parties are more ideologically coherent than they've ever been. So you actually have the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, not Republicans, Democrats of all various kinds, and so forth. And so whenever you have divided government, which I generally like, I think the government that governs least governs best, all things being equal. Perspective, but going forward, until there's a real realignment in terms of control of one party or one ideology having more control, this is what's going to keep coming up.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
A point that tends to get lost in the because taken for granted by everybody in the literature on the debt ceiling, but much pointed out by the President early on in this debt ceiling issue is that we're not talking about authorization to borrow money and incur debts in the future. As you know, I'm sure all of you know, we're talking about the President's power to issue bonds and debt in order to pay obligations that we have already incurred. At least that's true with respect to debt obligations in the formal sense. And the idea that basically it's fine to demand that Obamacare be abandoned as the price for increasing the debt ceiling, and Obama's unwillingness to do that, his saying that the payment of our debts is non-negotiable, does not represent a pig-headed insistence upon his having 100% of what he wants in the future with respect to future spending, with respect to next year's budget. Of course there should be, and there will be, negotiation on that. There may not be a resolution because the two sides are too dug in for that. And maybe we'll have a continuation of the sequester, maybe we'll have a new and even deeper sequester, who knows. But there will be negotiation and all that. It's just with respect to payment of our past bills that there is this unwillingness to negotiate. So it isn't just, we think that we're spending too much money now, so therefore we're not going to let you pay our past bill. Now, on the other hand, having said that, I have conceded that even with the debt ceiling, we will be able to pay interest on the debt. That will not be at risk or at stake, because the interest on the debt is only 6% of our total government expenditures. Social Security is 20-some-odd percent. Medicare, Medicaid is another 20-some-odd percent. Military spending is another 19 or 20%. Those are big-ticket items. It doesn't matter whether the debt ceiling is increased or not, we will be able to pay the debts that the Constitution requires us to pay.
Can you say a little bit more about continuing resolutions and how they, create incentives to continuously run up against the debt ceiling? What maybe some alternatives would be aside from maybe budget, as you said.
Well, I mean, so continuing resolutions just say that we will continue funding the government at the rate that it's been funded. And that you can pass them for short periods of time or up to a year, rather than actually going into the budget and changing priorities and creating new programs, cutting old ones, that sort of thing. The reason why we've had for 5 years now government by continuing resolutions is because, for a combination of various factors, there has been Congress hasn't been able to pass a budget, one or both houses, that the president would sign, and so that leads to some instability in terms of the nation's economic affairs. And that's why you hear talks of, oh, will Boehner and Reid and Obama work out a grand bargain, meaning entitlement reform, tax reform, get us going on passing actual budgets, rather than having these continuing resolutions, and now added with the sequester as well. The sequester is sort of like formulaic cuts, sort of like a continuing resolution that in a downward direction. I mean, they're very blunt instruments, and it's not so much. It's like when Belgium periodically, which has these multiple areas. It's a country that nobody knows why it exists, but they periodically, or most recently, I think there was about a 2 or 2.5 year period where there was no government, there was no elected government. There was literally a caretaker government. It's like the deputy civil servants were in charge, and they had no authority, no discretion to do anything other than just continue what they'd been doing before. And so that's sort of the way that that our budgetary process has been working.
Can I pose a hypothetical in this situation and ask how either of you think it would change the analysis if there were a Republican president who, let's say someone like Senator Cruz, someone who's really hardline on the budget, and that president vetoed a debt ceiling increase to force Congresses, or to try to pressure Congress to prioritize or cut something, or do whatever, refuse to approve any, and Congress couldn't override the veto. How would that change the moral trial on the dilemma?
Yeah. That's interesting, and I don't want to politicize this debate. I mean, Professor Goodman gave, I think, an analysis of the current situation and whether the Republicans would impeach Obama. I mean, I want to think about this, going forward, regardless of, which party controls which branch of government. But yeah, if you had the reverse situation where it was President Cruz and the coffee party or what have you, insisting on more spending and more raising the debt limit and all this other stuff, and he kept vetoing it. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I guess then you wouldn't have a dilemma, because Cruz would be perfectly fine saying, okay, good, then we're not going to spend anything, and Congress, you fix the constitutional crisis. That would be a very different dynamic. Equally threatening to the, I guess, the health of the country. I guess in that circumstance, Congress would probably drop articles of impeachment saying that the president is questioning the validity of the debt, violating Section 4 of the 14th Amendment. But again, if the president has just been reelected and he's popular, but Congress is also, I mean, it's this. It's hard to get a 2/3, even in normal times, it's hard to get 2/3 vote in the Senate for anything, let alone for impeachment. So it's an interesting kind of counterfactual to write. So any of you who want to write a novel about constitutional economic crises, that gives you some ammunition.
Well, could I speak to that? First of all, vetoing the congressionally enacted increase in the debt ceiling would not violate Article 4, Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, because, as I said, You can pay all of the interest and principal on the debt out of tax revenues as they come in. You don't have to be able to borrow a penny in order to do that. So I would exonerate President Cruz from charges of unconstitutionality on that score. Okay, time hasn't yet disproven the possibility that he could be elected president. And that hasn't, we don't have any hard evidence that he couldn't be elected president, but we do have some evidence that his veto would be overridden by Congress, because both houses, because 81 senators already voted to raise the debt ceiling, and it only takes 75 senators to override Cruz's veto. And in the House, 2/3 of the House also voted to increase the debt ceiling, and that's all it takes to, well, actually the House, well, no, we're not talking about impeachment now. The House, it only takes 2/3 in order to override the president's veto. So, Lee, you're asking us to assume, A, that he could be elected, and B, that his veto would not be overridden.
But it didn't have to be Cruz himself.
No, it doesn't have to be Cruz himself. It could be, I'm willing to accept that hypothetical. But it's on the basis of present evidence, the Speaker of the House would not present would not follow the Hastert rule. Otherwise, the House would never have enacted the debt ceiling increase in the first place, as you're assuming. So if the House were allowed to vote on it, 2/3 of them would vote to override the veto, and more than 2/3 of the Senate would vote that way. And that's the way I would resolve the hypothetical. Unless you gave me a further one. I mean, you could tell me that Nancy Palin was going to be president, and basically the House was going to change its mind and all of a sudden just have a bare majority for increasing the debt ceiling and so forth and so on. And I'd say we have the same problem we have now, that he would be confronted with the trilemma. He could say, you guys solve it, but he has an obligation, I think, to see that the laws be faithfully executed. He would be confronted with the same trilemma that Obama's now confronted by.
Yeah.
Does the Cato Institute have a particular preference as to what policy they're trying to push? I mean, not that they necessarily push policy, but what would you like to see happen over the long term with respect to the debt in general?
I would like us to get rid of all the unconstitutional parts of government, and that would obviate the debt ceiling issue going forward. In fact, that could be a method of prioritization of spending. The president decides that he won't spend on things, on programs that he thinks are unconstitutional. In all seriousness, that could be this is how I'm operating, this is how I'm prioritizing.
Such as?
Well,
What are all the unconstitutional parts?
Everything except the Justice Department, State Department, Treasury, and some things that the Treasury does are unconstitutional themselves, but mostly okay, and defense. Yeah.
Is there a particular, I mean, assuming that that's not a practicable approach in the next
Quite
year
intellectually
term?
tenable.
Right. I mean, is there a particular policy path that it would promote now, currently, to resolve the current?
Well, I mean, it's like talking about not even second order, but third order preferences, in the sense that our first preference would be for the government to stay within its constitutional bounds. Our second preference would be for the government to adjust its budgetary processes to recognize the laws of economics. Right? And now we're talking about the third preference. Everything's broken, and you have the situation, you have the trilemma, or whatever it is. I don't think anybody at Cato wants the president to act unilaterally, because it creates separation of powers problems. So, I mean, ideally, the president would work with, the debt ceiling is constitutional, but as I said, as Robert Levy has written, there are other methods of raising funds. You can sell public lands, you can do a number of things, and maybe the president could work with Congress on that. But again, if they can't resolve one issue issue, why would they get together to work on something else? It's ultimately, I think, an irresolvable problem within kind of constitutional separation of powers. And so, as Professor Goodman says, there is definitely enough money to pay the debt and the interest, and I don't know, I mean, at some point one side or another has to crack, or the whole republic or the economy collapses, and there is a true default whereby everybody, both Congress and the President, is repudiating the debt by not acting. I think they do have a constitutional obligation to together act. And the government is under a constitutional obligation to not repudiate. But when there are more than one, when there's more than one actor, it's hard to coordinate. So you can have this what's truly a constitutional crisis. So again, it's men aren't angels. The current politicians aren't. The current government's not angels. So we would like them to get together to pass an actual budget and take stock. But there's such different priorities. That's like saying, well, I would like Congress to pass a law allowing President Canute to roll back the tides. Well, then that's great, but realistically speaking, that's not. It's not like a normal policy proposal. Here's how we would reform healthcare. Here's how we would reform Social Security. I mean, this is, again, as I said, kind of a procedural third-order problem. So it's not, and as you see by the nature of the debate, it's not a libertarian versus conservative versus liberal, or originalist versus belief constitution, or what have you. It's this very weird amalgam of constitutional, political, and practical problems.
Does the Cato Institute take political positions?
We don't endorse candidates, or we don't support. We criticize everybody. We say good things rarely about politicians when they do something good, and whatever party they're from.
It is broadly libertarian.
Well, we don't support the Libertarian Party either, and there's a lot of debate within the building about whether the Libertarian Party historically has helped or hurt the cause of liberty by who does it siphon votes from, which key election. Right now in the Virginia election, right, the Libertarian candidate Rob Sarvis, who's a friend of mine, we actually clerked for the same judge, not at the same time, is polling in double digits. I think the latest average is like 10 or 12% or something. But there's also this survey that he's most of his support is either would otherwise be Democrats or people who wouldn't vote at all. So it's not necessarily the kind of the traditional thinking is that, well, the Libertarian candidate always siphons from the Republicans. Apparently the dynamic here isn't completely that way. So who knows?
All right, let's thank our guests one more time. We're actually ending at the time that we try to end today, so thank you all for coming. Next week we have a really great event. It will be, what's the speaker's name?
Jim Harper and
Jim Harper. Is he also from Cato?
He is.
Okay. And Professor Finkelstein, who is kind of a rare get for us. She's usually too busy with more important things to participate in our events. So we'll be pleased to have her. And we'll be talking about the NSA spying in the context of a modern, I guess, national security paradigm. So join us next week in the same room at the same time.